Ah, come closer, child. Sit by the fire and let me tell you a story from a time when the world had no fridges, no humming machines, just the cold bite of winter and the clever hands of folks who learned to tame it. Today, we're going back, way back, to the forgotten art of harvesting ice, long before ice boxes and freezers ever existed. You know, son, there was a time when cold meant more than just a setting on your refrigerator. Back then, before the hum of machines, before we learned to trap the seasons inside a metal box, winter was the only freezer we had. When the first frost came and the ponds glazed over like polished mirrors, folks didn't just admire the beauty of it. Oh no, they saw treasure. A silent kind of wealth, laid down by the hand of nature herself. In the early morning hours, before the sun broke over the trees, you'd hear the groan of wagon wheels and the stomp of boots on snow. The air was sharp enough to sting your lungs, and each breath came out like a ghost. Out on the frozen ponds, men would stand with iron saws and long poles, their faces red and raw from the cold. You could hear the rhythm, skrook, skrook, crack, splash, as they cut neat squares of ice, pulling them free with ropes and tongs. It wasn't just work, it was survival, and, in its own way, it was beautiful. They were harvesting winter itself. You see, before anyone had ever dreamed of an icebox or a refrigerator, people fought a constant battle with spoilage. Meat would turn in a day. Milk would sour before nightfall. And if you were unlucky enough to live through a hot summer without some clever storage, you might find half your year's work gone to rot. That's why cold, true, biting, natural cold, was something sacred. It meant preservation. It meant safety. It meant that your food, your medicine, even your comfort could last a little longer than the warmth allowed. In those colonial days, and even long before that, people learned to work with nature's rhythms. When the lakes froze, they'd gather ice. When the earth was soft, they dug deep into it, carving out cellars and pits that stayed cool even when the sun burned above. They didn't have electricity, but they had wisdom, the kind passed down by generations who watched and learned and listened to the seasons. In old Europe, they built stone houses half buried in the ground, thick-walled, shaded, and still as tombs. And in America, settlers carried those traditions with them, building icehouses near their farms and taverns. Thick timber doors, straw-packed walls, the scent of sawdust and frost clinging to every corner. Inside, through summer's heat, blocks of last winter's ice would sleep quietly in the dark, like frozen gold. You have to remember, ice wasn't common. It wasn't just lying around waiting for you to grab a handful. For much of human history, ice was a luxury, a token of the wealthy, the powerful, the curious. Kings and nobles in the 1600s had great underground chambers, glaciers they called them, where ice was stored behind stone and straw. To have cold wine in July? That was the height of sophistication. It was proof that you'd bent nature, even just a little, to your will. But for common folk, especially out in the colonies, ice was hard-earned. It was gathered from frozen ponds with aching backs and numb fingers. Every block they cut was a promise that milk would keep, that meat would stay fresh, that butter wouldn't melt into grease by the fire, and oh, the care they took. Each block carefully stacked in an icehouse, the gaps filled with sawdust from the mill. Insulation, though they didn't call it that back then. It was just good sense. The sawdust kept the ice from melting and sticking, and if you packed it right, that frozen treasure could last clear through the year. I tell you, boy, there's something different about a world that waits on the weather. When winter itself was your only friend against decay, you learned patience. You learned respect. You learned that the cold was both your enemy and your ally. Folks would watch the temperature drop in December, hoping for a deep freeze. Too warm, and the ponds wouldn't harden enough to cut. Too cold, and the ice grew brittle and cracked before you could pull it out. And the thing is, they didn't see it as a chore. It was part of the rhythm of life. In towns from New England to the French countryside, children would watch their fathers march out onto the ponds, bundled in layers of wool and determination. Women would brew hot cider and wait by the fires, ready to warm the hands of men who'd spent the morning battling the wind. There was laughter, too. The kind that turns into clouds in the cold air. They'd race each other cutting the lines, or carve initials in the ice blocks before stacking them away. These weren't men who thought of themselves as inventors or engineers, but in their quiet, practical way, they were both. They had found a way to stretch the life of a season, to borrow from winter and lend to summer. You can almost see it, can't you? A line of horse-drawn sledges creaking across the snow, a thin sun shining through the trees, the shimmer of ice glinting like crystal glass, hauled from the earth itself. That's what wealth looked like before banks and factories. A cellar full of good food, a family fed through the heat, and a block of ice sleeping under sawdust until the next frost came. Before machines took over, cold was a gift, and every bit of it had to be earned. They didn't just flip a switch and forget about it. They worked for it, prayed for it, depended on it. It tied them to the seasons, to the sky, to the water beneath their feet. Nowadays, we open a door and pull out a drink, never thinking about the miracle in our hand, the power to hold back time with a little hum of electricity. But once upon a time, that miracle was built by sweat and frost, by ingenuity and patience. So when the world outside was white and still, and the ponds groaned under their frozen skin, folks didn't just see winter as hardship. They saw it as opportunity. The only time when the world gave them the one thing summer never could: the power to keep what they loved a little longer. Ah, yes. Back then, winter was more than a season. It was a blessing, one that filled the icehouses, kept the butter firm, and reminded everyone that nature's cold heart could be a friend, if you learned how to listen.
Ah, Sonny, let me tell you how they did it. Back when winter itself was the master of the land, the work began before the sun had even climbed over the treetops. Men would trudge across frozen ponds, the snow crunching under boots, and mark the ice with long lines, careful and straight, a kind of frozen blueprint for the day's labor. Once the grids were set, they brought out the saws. Not little hand tools, mind you, but great horse-drawn saws, teeth sharp and ready. The horses would pull the frame along, groaning in rhythm with the men as the iron teeth chewed through the ice, sending sharp, ringing sounds echoing across the frozen expanse. Blocks of ice, smooth and clear, would be separated with long wooden poles, lifted with strong ropes, and slid carefully onto waiting sledges. And then the haul. A team of men, backs bent and muscles straining, would drag the ice through the crisp winter air to the ice house. Every step was measured, every block treated like gold, because in truth, to them, it was just that. Ice meant life. Ice meant survival. Ice meant the taste of summer stored safely through the bitter cold. The smell, sound, and teamwork. You could hear it before you saw it. The cracking of ice, like distant thunder in the quiet dawn. The creak of sledges, the snort of horses, the slap of frozen water against wood. And if you closed your eyes, you'd smell it, wet wood, pine-scented snow, the sharp, clean aroma of the frozen pond, and the faint hint of sweat on the men themselves. But it wasn't all toil and grunt. There was laughter, too. A slip here, a friendly jibe there. Men shouting jokes into the wind while their hands were numbed by frost. That camaraderie kept the work alive. It turned a back-breaking day into something bearable, even joyful. There was pride in those sounds, Sonny. Pride in knowing that every swing of a saw, every heave of a rope, would preserve life through the seasons. Now, not all ice stayed local, mind you. Some men, clever, ambitious, almost daring, saw a bigger horizon. Take Frederick Tudor, for instance. They called him the Ice King of New England. He didn't just harvest ice for the town or his neighbors. No, he shipped it across oceans all the way to the tropics. Can you imagine it? Tropical islands receiving blocks of frozen New England ponds, carried in wooden crates, insulated with sawdust, preserved against the burning sun. Tudor's enterprise changed the way people thought about ice. It was no longer a mere luxury for nearby towns. It became a global commodity, a wonder to those who had never felt winter's chill. And yet, he started small, just like the men back on the ponds, hauling each block with care, respecting the gift of frost. Towns depended on winter's success. Entire towns lived and breathed by winter's favor. A poor freeze could spell disaster. Milk spoiled, meat lost, butter melted before it could reach the cellar. Farmers, bakers, grocers, tavern owners all depended on the harvest of ice. When the frost came deep and true, there was celebration. When it was weak, worry and planning filled the homes. It tied everyone together. The men on the ponds weren't just workers. They were lifelines. Their success meant survival for families, for communities. They understood the stakes in a way most of us can't imagine today. Every block of ice represented hope, security, and ingenuity. The fruits of winter's labor turned into the sustenance of summer. Colonial icehouses. Once the ice arrived at the village or estate, it wasn't simply piled in a corner. No, these were serious structures, thick-walled, built of brick or stone, often buried halfway into the ground. Inside, the ice would rest in layers, separated by straw or sawdust, carefully stacked to slow the inevitable melting. Imagine walking into one of those colonial ice houses, sunny. Cool air washing over your face, a faint sparkle of frost on every surface, the scent of damp straw mingled with cold stone. It was both humble and magnificent, a man-made sanctuary that kept the chill of winter alive long after the snow had gone. And while America had its ponds and ice houses, Europe had a tradition all its own. In France and England, nobles built grand glaciers on their estates, stone or brick structures, sometimes buried or tucked into shady slopes. These were engineering marvels in their day. Ventilation shafts, layered insulation, even channels to carry meltwater. Ice was stored not just for food, but for wine, for medicine, for the comforts of a luxurious life. The technology was different, the scale grander, but the principle was the same: respect for nature and the patience to bend it, just a little, to human need. And at the heart of it all, there was something more than work. There was pride, quiet, steadfast, communal pride, pride in knowing that every shovelful of sawdust, every layer of ice carefully stacked, Every horse led along the frozen trail. It all mattered. Communities bonded over the harvest of ice. Neighbors shared the bounty. Families relied on one another, and a sense of accomplishment hung in the cold air like smoke from the chimneys. These weren't grand gestures or lofty monuments. They were simple, human acts. Acts of ingenuity, cooperation, and respect for the seasons. And maybe that's why I love telling you this, child, not just because it's clever or strange, but because it reminds us that human hands working together can take even the coldest, harshest of winters and turn it into something that sustains life, something that preserves joy and family and hope. So, when you think of ice, don't just think of it as frozen water. Think of the men and women who labored through frost and snow, the towns that depended on their skill, and the quiet pride that each block carried. They weren't just harvesting ice. They were harvesting life itself. Summer's cold secret, the ingenious ice houses of old Europe. Ah, lad, if winter was a gift, then summer was the test. Keeping the cold alive when the sun was blazing, that was the art. You see, across the hills and valleys of old Europe, there were strange little mounds, half-buried stone huts, some hidden beneath gardens or beside quiet streams. Most folk walked past them without knowing the wonder that lay beneath. Inside those thick-shadowed walls was winter itself, sleeping. They called them glaciers, ice houses, or sometimes frost cellars, built of stone and brick, often buried deep into the earth. Their purpose was simple yet profound: to preserve the ice harvested in winter for the long, hungry months ahead. Imagine stepping into one on a summer day, the air cold and still, your breath turning to mist as you crossed the threshold. The faint smell of straw, the quiet drip of melting ice, the echo of silence, a chamber of cold in a world of warmth. It was as if the earth itself had been convinced to hold its breath, to keep winter alive just a little longer. How the ice houses were built. Building an ice house wasn't guesswork, oh no. It was a marvel of engineering, cleverness born from patience and need. The thick stone walls kept out heat, and many were built half-buried into shaded slopes or beneath orchards. The roofs were steep and thatched, sometimes layered with soil or moss for insulation. Inside, craftsmen designed the floor with channels to carry away meltwater, because even the most perfect block of ice must eventually weep a little, you see. Straw or sawdust filled the spaces between the layers of ice, keeping air from sneaking in. A well-built ice house could hold its cargo for months, even a year, if the winter had been kind. Some estates even had 2 ice houses, one for the family's table and another for medicine, preserving herbs and remedies that the apothecary prized. Every brick, every shovel of straw, every layer of frost inside was a testament to the human will to shape nature gently and wisely. The grand ice houses of nobility. Now, not all ice houses were humble huts tucked behind barns. Oh no, the nobility of Europe turned them into monuments of pride. In England, France, and the Low Countries, great estates had domed or vaulted ice houses, beautiful as chapels, with stone arches and carved lintels. The French chateaux glaciers were especially magnificent, built near lakes or shaded groves with hidden channels that led directly to the water, allowing the servants to float the ice in and store it deep below. The walls were thick, often double-layered, and the entrances narrow to keep the cold sealed tight. In summer, the lords and ladies would boast of chilled wine, frozen desserts, and cool fruit, luxuries that only ice could afford. But beneath their pleasure lay the hands of dozens of workers, those who had labored in frost and sweat alike to make that cold possible. Even in grandeur, there was respect for the winter's labor. But not every soul lived in a manor. For common folk, ice houses were simpler, but no less vital. Some dug pits in shaded earth, lined them with timber and straw, covering them with thick thatch and soil. These humble ice cellars held just enough ice to keep butter firm, milk fresh, and meat from spoiling in the heat. They were often built near wells or shaded streams, nature's allies in the fight against the summer sun. And though the villagers lacked fine architecture, they had ingenuity and care. They knew where the sun rose, where the wind blew, where the ground stayed coolest. They built with instinct, guided by generations of observation. Step inside one of those small cellars, and you'd find the air damp and cold, carrying the scent of earth and straw. It was humble work, yes, but it was clever, resourceful, and built with love. For in those dim, cool rooms lay the comfort of a family's table, the promise that no child would go hungry when the days grew long and hot. You see, lad, ice wasn't just for luxury. It was survival. In kitchens, it kept milk sweet, butter solid, and meat safe from the summer rot. In taverns, it cooled ale and cider. In apothecaries, it preserved herbs, poultices, and even soothed fevers. For sailors preparing for long voyages, it kept salted fish and meat fresh longer, buying them precious days on the open sea. And oh, the simple joy it brought on a hot afternoon. A jug of chilled water, a slice of fruit cooled by stored frost. It was a quiet miracle, the taste of winter in midsummer, a bridge between seasons built by human hands. The ice houses were not just buildings, they were the pulse of survival, a reminder that even in the harshest of times, mankind learned not to fight nature, but to partner with it, to borrow a bit of its chill and keep it safe until it was needed most. To keep cold in the heat. Now there's something poetic about that, eh? The ice house became a symbol of patience and foresight. It wasn't just about storage, it was about memory. Inside those stone chambers slept a season, a promise, and a piece of time itself. When the doors were opened in July and that breath of cold air escaped into the sunlight, it felt like magic, a whisper from another world. For a moment, you could close your eyes and hear the frozen pond again, the wind of January, the laughter of men hauling ice through snow. Each block stored not just frost, but the memory of work, of unity, of a winter's endurance. It was living proof that even warmth has need of cold, that one season carries the gift of another. But, like all things, even that era had its twilight. By the late 1800s, new machines came rumbling to life, refrigeration, compressors, electric motors. The ice houses grew silent, their doors sealed, their stone walls forgotten by time. Moss crept over the roofs, birds nested in the cracks, the last echoes of dripping water faded, and the world moved on to easier ways. But if you wander through the countryside today and find a strange mound of stone, half hidden under ivy, take a closer look. You may still feel a faint breath of cool air rising from the earth, like a ghost of winter past. That, my dear child, is the earth remembering what we once knew, that even in heat we must hold on to what keeps us whole. That knowledge, that respect, that balance between fire and frost, that was the true genius of our ancestors. So you see, lad, these weren't just cellars of stone. They were vaults of time, where the heartbeat of winter waited patiently for the warmth to come, and where man learned that sometimes, to keep living, you must first learn how to keep the cold. You see, lad, every age has its marvel. For us, it was not steam or steel, it was ice. It changed the way the world lived, traded, and even dreamed. From the frozen ponds of little villages to the great ships that carried ice across oceans, that silent crystal reshaped the rhythm of life. Ice meant health. It meant preservation. It meant comfort and wonder. A sip of cool water in the heat of harvest, a sweet fruit chilled like snow on the tongue. It brought medicine to the sick, fresh food to the distant, and hope to those who feared the rot of summer. And then, almost without a whisper, it vanished. The rise of the modern cold. When machines came, noisy, shining, proud, they promised to do what nature had done for free. Iron giants that hummed and breathed cold into metal boxes. The first refrigerators and ice machines made ice endless, effortless, and soon the ice houses grew quiet. The ponds stopped echoing with the chop of saws. The sledges stood still. The ice cutters hung up their axes, their breath no longer turning white in the air. The frost cellars melted into memory. And yet, though the work was gone, the wonder remained. The miracle of cold, it still carried that old whisper of gratitude. For deep inside, every freezer hums the memory of a pond, of frost, and the sweat of men who once wrestled winter itself. I sometimes think, my boy, that the ice harvesters were philosophers without knowing it. They knew the value of patience, that some things can't be rushed, that cold has its own pace and silence. They taught us something the modern world too easily forgets, that comfort comes not from ease, but from effort. Those men didn't just store ice. They stored wisdom. They built communities on cooperation, endurance, and quiet respect for nature's rhythm. And though their craft is gone, their lesson still stands, that the things we work hardest for stay with us longest. Now the world is warmer, faster, louder. The hum of machines has replaced the song of saws on frozen lakes. But if you ever walk through the woods and find a mound of old stones buried in ivy, stop a while, place your hand on it. Feel that faint chill that never quite left. That's not just cold air, that's history breathing. That's winter's ghost, resting gently in the soil. You'll be touching the past, the sweat, the frost, the heartbeat of those who once kept the cold so we could live in warmth. And perhaps, in that quiet moment, you'll understand the ice never truly disappeared. It simply changed its home, from ponds and cellars to the memory of humankind. So remember, lad, every time you open your fridge, you're opening a door to the past, to a world of frozen rivers and brave hands, to the time when winter was a treasure and man learned how to keep a piece of it forever.